Hey, it's Jordan. I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Jill Stein, who obviously was the Green Party presidential candidate in 2016. And I've always enjoyed talking to you and give you credit, by the way. You were one of the few candidates, actually, no, the only candidate who went to Standing Rock and was on the ground there. So I wanted to start, hopefully this will be a more pleasurable experience for you. But I saw you on CNN the other night, and it seemed that, like other interviews I've seen in the past, you know, it's almost like the CNN anchor, Aaron Burnett, was essentially the main goal was to get you to admit that you are responsible for Donald Trump. So I'd like to ask you straight up, were you the one that gave Hillary Clinton the advice to not go to Wisconsin, to spend campaign resources to go to Arizona in the final week of the campaign, and other things like not going on radio in African American communities until the week of the campaign? Were you responsible for all those things? Because if you look at it from a political lens, that played a part in her defeat.
And I would add to that, was I responsible for this brilliant strategy of elevating the so-called Pied Piper candidates, the nutcakes in the Republican Party, to make it easier for Hillary Clinton to win? Was I responsible for sabotaging Bernie Sanders and for incurring the wrath and the ire of millions of supporters who basically had their votes thrown out, and for whom the primary was meaningless, and their efforts were basically thrown under the bus by the manipulation of the primary election. So yeah, no, I don't think I did that. And I would add to that our votes are not owned by the Democratic Party or by the Republican Party. If you want to get really technical about it, you can actually look at the exit polls that showed that most people who voted Green in 2016 were not going to come out and vote. So, it's not only preposterous, but it's actually a lie to say that those votes belong to Hillary. And furthermore, if you were to add in the Gary Johnson voters, which nobody ever talks about, that would have further, their logic doesn't hold up, because if you assume Green votes belong to the Democrat, you'd have to assume that Libertarian votes belong to the Republican, in which case Trump wins by an even bigger margin. And it's like part of the screwed up logic that tries to get people to, not resist, to basically submit to this very irrational and predatory voting system, a political system that just doesn't make sense, when in fact there's a win-win here. We can actually create a voting system that works for us, that works for everyday working people. And by the way, aside from whatever it was, 1 or 2 million who voted for me, there were 100 million who sat it out. So didn't that count for something? That they were not reached by the political messaging that basically said you've got to vote for one of these two predator parties in a election where the two establishment candidates were the most disliked and untrusted in recorded history. So, just the whole logic here is so twisted. And the bottom line, Jordan, is this: CNN cut out of the tape, the video clip that they circulated, they cut out the first 3 minutes,
right,
which will be circulating soon. But those first 3 minutes basically said, look, we can cut to the chase here. We don't have to be paralyzed by spoiler panic. It's not a real thing, but it is in people's minds. Elections are not spoiled by a diversity of candidates. Elections are actually spoiled by the lack of diversity of candidates and the suppression of those diverse choices. But in fact, we can just cut to the chase here, folks. Ranked choice voting fixes this. It means you can rank your choices. It means the whole spoiler panic is obsolete. Spoiler panic comes from a very understandable and real place. I think there's great existential despair right now about our election system, our economy, our planet, our healthcare system, you name it. we're pretty screwed right now, especially the younger generation who's really got to bear the full force of this catastrophe that's barreling down on us. Whatever sector of society you want to look at, whether it's our healthcare, our education, student debt that's got an entire generation really trapped, these wars that just get bigger all the time, racial violence and injustice, economic violence, and, which is racial also, of our prison system, you name it. We're kind of screwed right now. Your goose is cooked, and little solutions around the margins aren't going to fix it. We really need a substantive change here. And the good news is that you don't have to be bludgeoned back into these two pigeonholes that are driving this crisis. You don't have to be forced. And that's why both Tucker Carlson on Fox and Aaron Burnett on CNN, they did not want to talk about ranked choice voting because it spoils their game. They want to do this blame shame game and intimidate and vilify independent voters. But that's where most people are. 60% practically of voters want something else. So instead of slapping their hands and telling them you got to be good little boys and girls, we could just fix the voting system. And they don't want that word to get out. But I really want to underscore that right now, that ranked choice voting is a win-win. The state of Maine just adopted it, and it was really proof of principle in their congressional election where at the end of the runoff, it was the more progressive candidate who won, and there were more voters who came out and voted. There was greater diversity in the vote, less negative campaigning. I mean, it's a win-win all around. Choice is not the enemy of a just and rational voting system. It's really critical for a just and rational voting system. So the name of the game is we got 2 years, and Aaron Burnett tried using that one on me, that, oh no, we got to work with the voting system we have. You can't change it. This is what we got. Well, hello, Aaron Burnett and other apologists for oligarchy. We have 2 years practically before the next election. And if we could pass $1 trillion Wall Street bailout and more, in about 24 hours, I think we can fix our voting system. And the beauty of ranked choice voting is that you don't have to do it in Congress. You can just do it state by state.
Right.
And there are, 14 states right now that have all Democratic legislatures and Congress. And Republicans benefit from this too. So, if we applied half the panic and hysteria that's going into suppressing alternatives right now and suppressing independent voters, if we put half of that energy into really holding our legislators' feet to the fire, we could get ranked choice voting within, the next year, the next legislative cycle, et cetera. We can fix this. So let's put our energy where we can really cure the problem. This is like the win-win that CNN and Fox don't want you to know about.
Well, it's interesting you brought up ranked choice voting because I've mentioned in a lot of my videos, frankly, the Green New Deal, not a new idea. And you and the Green Party, not exactly getting a lot of credit. Now, I know Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's version, I don't know, it seems a little more vague, might not be the same exact thing, but these ideas, I mean, you and the Green Party were shouting from a cave for a long time, and now it's kind of becoming mainstream. So these things can happen when there's organizing behind it, and it forces it into the corporate media. So I'd love to know what you think as far as, A, what I just said, the Green New Deal, but also maybe that's what is necessary to force that discussion of ranked choice voting, which is, more organization, because even in independent media, you don't hear a lot about ranked choice voting.
Exactly. There's some really great organizing going on for ranked choice voting right now. And if people follow my social media feed, which is at Dr. Jill Stein, and that's DR, you'll hear about it. There's also a really great organization. There are a number of them, but one in particular called Voter Choice MA, as in Massachusetts, .org. So that's voterchoicema.org. And they will soon be going national, I think, because they're doing such a good job of moving ranked choice voting forward. And, it's not going to happen. The revolution will not be televised, and ranked choice voting will not be televised, but it's up to us. And it really does work, reduces negative campaigning. It ensures that whoever gets elected with a majority vote. They're not the product of some random division of the electorate, depending on how many candidates happen to run representing a certain point of view. It's totally arbitrary what goes into the division of that vote. And by the way, looking at the Democratic presidential primary right now, you've got all these pseudo-progressives and a couple of, arguably progressive candidates who will all be splitting the vote. And in particular, because they're especially, they're dividing up the Democratic vote. We were drawing largely from non-voters, but Democrats are going to pretty much divide the Democratic vote. So they're going to be splitting it a whole bunch of different ways. Who's going to come out on top? It will be that one or two centrist candidates, Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or whoever's got the money behind them. They're going to go into the second round of voting at the Democratic Convention, which is where the superdelegates get back in. So it's a perfect scenario. And I think, the silencing of ranked choice voting, the silencing of, for example, the green origins of the Green New Deal, this doesn't happen by accident.
Right.
That ambush on CNN, that doesn't happen by accident. There is a what you might call a progressive containment plan going on right now. Wow. In some elections, there's clearly a sheepdogging candidate. Well, I think the Democrats are sheepdogging all the time by allowing progressives to be seen and heard and then pulling the rug out from under them, when it comes time to actually, have the vote or choose the candidate. They're sabotaged or they're manipulated in one way or another. And same goes for the progressive policies that Democrats appear to support. Look what's happening right now to not only to the Green New Deal, which has been pretty much sabotaged by the climate committee that was created. It doesn't have the powers to move this forward. There was no way in hell that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer were going to allow this kind of a transformative program to be enacted on their watch. No way in the world. But it's also happening to single payer. And H.R. 676, which was the gold standard for single payer, that number has been given to a pro-NATO, cheerleading kind of bill. And it's like the history's been wiped out.
And Pramila Jayapal is watering that down as we speak.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And behind closed doors, too. So it's like, don't get your hopes up, progressives. Democrats are not going to deliver it to you. And don't be intimidated by the spoiler panic. Just get to work right now. Instead of trying to silence the progressive alternatives out there, get behind ranked choice voting and make that absolutely the lead for all the other things. It really is a gateway to doing all the other stuff, because the spoiler panic shuts down dialogue. And that's why we've been scrubbed. Greens have been scrubbed. It's not that the revolt isn't still there. The rebellion is home, even in the midterms. Huge numbers of people stayed home. And people are not happy, especially look at what's going on in Venezuela right now, or around the warmongering around Russia or even North Korea. You have Democrats that are really leading the charge in this vast and dangerous war machine, also leading the charge on the new McCarthyism, which essentially tries to shut down dialogue and alternatives. It's a really scary thing, and the Democrats are right there in the driver's seat, every bit as much with the Republicans. So, we should not be bullied into silence, which is what they're trying to do. It's really important for us to stand up and use that advantage that we have. Ranked choice voting enables us all to fight together to get rid of Trump. We can really dump Trump, and we're going to do that much more effectively if we've mobilized a very broad swath of the political spectrum. If you just are going to mobilize the centrist Democrats, it's going to be a very tough race.
Mm-hmm. That's a good segue, because I wanted to ask you about Russia and Trump. Number one, it seems very odd to me that, oh my Lord, there was fake Facebook pages and hide under your desk, the Russian boogeyman is coming, so our democracy is under grave threat. But in the same breath, the very same people screaming about that are totally fine with us essentially, overnight, it's not even overnight, it was planned months in advance, inserting a 35-year-old nomad into the Venezuelan presidency, which, by the way, these economic sanctions are part of why Venezuela is so dire. So I'd like your thoughts on that contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that the people who are screaming about, Russia, they launched social media memes like this. Like, if you believe in Jesus. I don't know if you can see this.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's laughable. And if you actually look at this critique, and Aaron Mate did a really beautiful job of breaking it down. If you actually look at it, most of the postings actually came after the election. Only 11%, something like that, actually dealt with the election. They were more about Jesus, or there's this other beautiful one with this guy,
Yeah.
What does that have to do with the election? Did that persuade people to vote for me? I don't think so. That was really it was a smear. It was a smear campaign, and the coolest part of it is that this cybersecurity firm, the New Knowledge firm, you've probably heard about this, Jordan. Yeah. Shortly after they put out this grand expose of how Russia was persuading people of color to vote for me through, things like Yosemite Sam. After they put out this ludicrous report, within the same week, they were exposed for having interfered themselves in a 2017 Senate election. And how did they do that? They did it by creating a false flag Russian interference campaign and trying to pin that on the Republican opponent. This was like Democrat money funded. So it makes a complete mockery, not only of their effort to smear me, but it makes it really tarnishes the whole, Russiagate investigation. And I have to say, I support the basic core of the Mueller investigation following Trump's, firing of Comey, which really looked, extremely suspicious and was very suggestive of obstruction of justice and of underlying corruption, just given the amount of lying that was going on from members of his administration. I very much support the essential, mission of Russiagate, but it's really important that it not spill over into this misuse and abuse into the realm of outright McCarthyism and of, being used as a tool to smear and discredit political opposition and as a tool for warmongering. And it's a very fine line between those. And it's really important, I think, that we not, embrace one oversimplified solution or the other. It's not like Russiagate is all wrong, but where it's overextended, and abused, that's really wrong when it spills over into warmongering and this effort to vilify political opposition. And clearly that happened in that particular report and that effort to smear my campaign and the Green Party.
Well, I will point out, because obviously CNN has no journalistic ethics, but number one, they should have disclosed that CNN's recent former parent company, Time Warner, was Hillary Clinton's one of her top donors in her career, I think in the top 10. So that might be something you want to tell your audience. But the second thing is, when you brought up the New Knowledge report and they tried to shut you down, the New Knowledge report is from former NSA people, former Defense Department, and former President Bill Clinton's CIA director has financial ties to New Knowledge. That would be William Connolly. So, I mean, all of these reports, a Senate intelligence report, no, it's a third-party report with, I'll say it, kind of the authors of the deep state, shall I say. So all of these reports, whether it's CrowdStrike, New Knowledge, you have to actually, who is funding these reports? Who are the authors of these reports? So that's just my 2 cents.
And while you're on it, you can also go back to the origins of the whole, Russiagate proposition with the MI5 agent
Steele dossier.
Yeah, with the Steele dossier, which had its origins. Actually, it was Republican and then it was Democrat. But it was Democrat funded for a substantial period of time. And, lo and behold, oh, surprise, surprise, it contains a handful of names. And one of them is mine, where it makes the outright false accusation, a complete lie, saying that I was being funded by Russia, which is absolutely false. And it tries to smear me for being a peace advocate and an advocate for diplomacy and dialogue. And when I went to Russia, I went there really to promote 3 issues which were fundamental to my campaign. It's not like I was saying this to Russians. In the same trip, I happened to talk also with Jeremy Corbyn and also with the deputy climate negotiator for China at the Paris Climate Accord. So, these are really critical issues that need to be addressed domestically in the U.S., but we also need to address them internationally. And that is, the climate crisis, endless war, the nuclear confrontation that we are facing, and also, the Green New Deal as an integrative solution there. And that's what I was really there for. And if you just look at what's in the news this week about the nuclear treaties that are falling apart, starting actually with U.S. efforts. You can go back to George Bush, who pulled out of the fundamental nuclear treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, back in 2000, I think. When George Bush did that, it's been downhill ever since, which is disastrous. And most recently now the Trump administration is pulling out of what's called the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is so dangerous, it's unbelievable. We've got 2,000 nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert. And if you don't think that's a concern, listen to the series of talks that Daniel Ellsberg gave just recently on the Real News Network, which will really light your hair on fire about the dangers even before these deals have fallen apart. And now these treaties are falling apart. We, by the way, we reinvigorated the nuclear arms race back in the Obama years when we appropriated and basically put out a plan to spend, $1.5 trillion, some huge amount of money. It may be more than $1.5 trillion, but it's on the order of trillions for a new generation of nuclear weapons. It's absolutely outrageous. And to me, it's like, it's really an all-out emergency that we've got to be talking about this stuff, because the public has been denied knowledge of how the public is really on the firing line right now. And if that information were out, it would be a whole different ballgame for doing something about it, which is why, to me, it keeps coming back to not only, number one, we need more than just 2 parties of war in Wall Street. We need an agenda, and we need proponents of that agenda who are challenging power. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And we need to be there in that political dialogue. But number 2 is that we need to pass ranked choice voting like our lives depend on it. Because otherwise they're going to keep shutting down the dialogue. If we open it up, it's fixable.
I wanted to ask you about 2020, not necessarily like who's going to win or any of that stuff, but it does seem to me, if I want to borrow from Chomsky, it seems they're manufacturing consent for Kamala Harris. I mean, we'll see if Biden enters, but I mean, you got CNN a day after she announces, they're doing a love fest for an hour with her. They hadn't offered that to any other declared candidate, a town hall. You see them, not questioning. Well, she ran for Senate in 2016. She wasn't for Medicare for all then when it was possible in California. Now all of a sudden she's for Medicare for all. I mean, we see this all, like, I call it extreme makeover, Hillary Clinton edition, Kamala Harris edition. So they're manufacturing consent on that end. And the other end is, I mean, look at the government shutdown coverage. Did any media ever ask, well, maybe we should look into why are so many government workers living paycheck to paycheck? Why are so many workers living paycheck to paycheck? So I'd like to ask you, are we going to get anything different? Because it seems to me they're anointing her, as their Hillary Clinton for a coronation.
It's certainly looking that way, and there are just many red flags going up right now, not only in the support that's being given to Kamala Harris, which is kind of breathtaking considering her, her support for the death penalty, her refusal to investigate Steve Mnuchin when her own Attorney General office in California was saying, investigate this guy. He's got thousands of violations of foreclosure laws and foreclosure protections for, poor people and families and kids. This guy is a real predator. And she shut that down. She refused to proceed with that investigation. Her opposition to allowing out second strike nonviolent drug offenders because she wanted their labor for the prison system. I mean, I'm sort of new to Kamala Harris. To my mind, she hasn't been worthy of following. So I'm just learning about this stuff for the first time, but it's pretty jaw-dropping. And the parallels to Hillary Clinton are disturbing, very disturbing, and don't bode well. If you put that together with the Democrats' rollback of their progressive agenda, with the fact that there was more big money that went into the 2018 midterms than ever, the 40 or so new congressional representatives in the districts that flipped are mostly coming from privileged suburban Republicanoid districts,
Right.
So this doesn't make for a progressive Democratic Party. And then just look at their appointments between Hakeem Jeffries, who's really a tool of Wall Street and the charter school industry. He's appointed to head of the Democratic Party caucus. Joe Manchin, who's a servant of the fossil fuel industry, is in charge of the Energy Committee. Elliot Engel, who is like the war hawk of war hawks, and where are the Democrats right now? Aside from Ro Khanna and Ilhan Omar, there is a deafening silence going on about Venezuela. Yeah, a couple people put out a tweet or two, but this crisis is evolving and it needs to be resisted vehemently, like now.
And I should point out Bernie has not been strong on that either.
Hardly. I mean, he did put out one, reasonable tweet, but I haven't seen anything since. And a lot of damage has been done. Where were they on Elliot Abrams' appointment? The appointment of a war criminal to head the Venezuela effort, saying, El Salvador and Guatemala, here we come. This is all about war crimes and death squads, and that's the mind of Elliot Abrams. It's like you have the four horses of the apocalypse, between Trump, Abrams, Bolton, and Pompeo. And it's hard to say that name without saying Pompous.
Yeah.
Pompeius, it's hard to actually say Pompeo. But this is who's driving policy, and where's the counterweight of this opposition party? Democrats are just not capable of doing it.
And Elliot Engel being anything with Venezuela is the equivalent of Dick Cheney being in charge of Standing Rock. I mean, it's just absurd. But I want to ask you also, because to me, in a sane political world, you have Donald Trump. They're focused very much on Russia, but the actual effective and truthful actual strategy is, hey, look around. You see any of these plants opening up? Hey, look around. You see Foxconn, this sweetheart deal that they just gave, I think 4.5 million of taxpayer subsidies in Wisconsin. Now they're suddenly not manufacturing these LS glass things. I mean, there is an economic message against Trump, but I'd love to know what you think. I think the Democrats aren't making it because, well, they're kind of complicit in all these factories being closed.
Absolutely. And Foxconn, it's actually billions in subsidies that they've been offered. It's staggering. They then said, well, sorry, we're not gonna, we're not gonna actually create the jobs. And now maybe Trump is trying to twist their arms some more. But, businesses, especially small businesses, are in absolute crisis, and this has been going on for quite a while. This isn't just a Republican problem. It's been a Republican and a Democratic problem. Yeah, but, to make your point, they're absolutely complicit. There are 30 million Americans that don't have health care at all, any health insurance, and far more who have the insurance but can't afford to use it. And you don't see the Democrats coming out swinging on that either. All they want to do is, let's stay the course. Let's stay the course. Let's just stop the further, collapse of our civil society and our civilization. Yeah, they're totally complicit here, and which is why, to my mind, this keeps coming back to the fact that we need to be politically armed. And in order to be politically armed and actually fight the fight, we have to re-engage dialogue. We've got to neutralize the spoiler panic. Because the minute we neutralize the spoiler panic, it's 60% practically of Americans who are clamoring for another political alternative. And this is why they are working so hard to keep this genie in the bottle right now, because once it's out, their days are numbered. And I just really want to encourage people to adopt a fighting stance. According to the UN, we got 12 years, before the climate is, over the cliff and beyond the pale. And, with this, the deep freeze and the wildfires in Australia right now, it's just a suggestion of what the future looks like, because it's going to keep getting worse day by day practically. And, people always say, it'll be this horrible by the end of the century. Yeah, but what they don't tell you is that after that, it gets even worse. So they're being gentle in how they're allowing the crisis to be characterized right now. But I don't think that's doing us any favors. Not to recognize that we've got a lethal illness, and it's going to destroy us pretty quickly in the absence of, guess what, our taking power. And guess what, we've got the numbers to take power. And guess what, there's a real route to do it in so many ways. So I just really want to encourage people to, to stand up and fight back and make ranked choice voting happen in your state. It can be pushed through the legislature, and then there are many states that also have, referendum options. Mm-hmm. But, don't let them bully you into submission here, because to submit is to basically lie down on the railroad tracks, and that train is coming fast. We got solutions. They are close at hand, and they're absolutely practical and feasible, and all we got to do is put them on the table, and it's not going to be so hard to mobilize public will, for the kind of change that we really need.
I want to ask you, to me, in addition to ranked choice voting, I think it's very clear we need some type of yellow vest movement in the United States. But I think the difference between here and France, they don't have employer-based health insurance. And I think people here, there's a real psychological fear of, I'm not going to work or for a week to go out there and protest. And people are afraid to risk it because literally paycheck to paycheck is what it means. Do you think that could ever happen here? And do you think it's necessary?
Yeah, it's absolutely necessary. And I think, at the end of the day, it's really social movements that create transformative change, whether you look at the abolition of the criminal institution of slavery, or you look at women achieving the right to vote, the labor movement. All of these things had an electoral component, but the real driver was always the social movement. So yes, I agree with you completely, and that's a whole other discussion. But yes, we really need to be organized. We need to bring back the ability to strike, and it's not as well as to get out in the streets, but we need the general strike, and we sort of lost our capacity and our skills to do that. But it's not rocket science. And, we can share those skills again. That's definitely where we need to go. But I think we're going to go there. I just, the only question is when. People may have health insurance right now, or many people do, but there's so many who can't afford to use it. And, just to look at like our health is crumbling right now. Our lifespan is becoming shorter. In this country alone, we have an epidemic of diseases of despair, and that's especially in communities who are being hit economically right now. So I think people are kind of at the tipping point right now, and it's not going to take that much. In the same way that the federal workers, were very close to striking. They were calling in sick, and let's hope we don't have another shutdown, because the outrage that of the crisis that was imposed on them was just awful. And it's not like they've recovered, and there are millions who will never get paid and all that. But the walkout that was beginning to happen, or at least the sick out in the airlines industry, that will bring the economy to a halt very quickly. And it's not hard to see that happening. Workers, I think, are just being, if you look at the numbers, half of wage earners right now are just barely at the poverty level. They're making like $30,000 a year or less. That's, can't get by on that. It's paycheck to paycheck, but it's barely even that. And people are falling further and further behind. So it's just a question of when this tripwire is going to get kicked. And, there's a very powerful revolt in the making, and I think we need to have a political channel for that revolt as well, and the two together are very powerful.
Right.
Unstoppable, I think.
And my final question, and I demand the truth, can you confirm or deny that you were a part of the evil Russian cabal that Rachel Maddow huffed and puffed about the other night, that Russia could potentially shut down our electricity to kill all the Americans during the polar vortex?
In what way would I be a part of that evil cabal? I'm not sure, but put it this way, Michael Flynn, turned state's evidence a long time ago. I think I would have heard from Mueller by now if there was a shred of evidence of my participation in anything untoward. And, I would tell Rachel and the other fearmongerers or McCarthyites, I would say, just go look at my website, because I was, unlike the others who've been accused, I was public in real time about exactly what was going on, what I was saying, who I was meeting with, and there's never been a shred of evidence that any of that has been incomplete or untruthful in any way. I think far from apologizing for promoting peace and diplomacy, I think my role in 2016 should be held up as a model for what the war parties need to be emulating right now, in particular, so that we can have a future we can actually survive in.
Yeah, I was saying it in jest because, honestly, watching that segment, I don't know if you saw it, but it reminded me of Glenn Beck with the red phone back in the days on Fox News. I mean,
this is the director of national intelligence telling us all in unclassified form, in black and white, China and Russia can do this today, now, whenever they want to. In other words, we're relying on their good graces that they're not. And it is like negative 50 degrees in the Dakotas right now. What would happen if Russia killed the power in Fargo today? Right? What would happen if all the natural gas lines that service Sioux Falls just poofed on the coldest day in recent memory, and it wasn't in our power whether or not to turn them back on? I mean, what would you do if you lost heat indefinitely as the act of a foreign power on the same day the temperature in your front yard matched the temperature in Antarctica. I mean, what would you and your family do?
I don't know if she's acting or really has lost her marbles, but it is beyond the pale. And I will mention one thing that's not brought up a lot in terms of you and this kind of ridiculousness. Why is nobody asking anybody about all these think tanks that are taking money from the UAE and Saudi Arabia and, you know, sitting at dinners with them? I mean, you want to look at Putin versus Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, you know, not exactly so starkly different. So it seems amazing to me that it's very much a McCarthyite thing, but other very questionable countries and leaders, that's okay.
And in fact, there was evidence of very clear collusion between members of the Trump administration and Israel.
Yeah.
You know, and in fact, they were lobbying Russia to help, you know, to help basically block a certain vote in the UN Security Council. They were trying to protect Israel. Mm-hmm. You know, and they were colluding on behalf of Israel. You know, we haven't heard a whole lot about that. And speaking of collusion, you know, while we're at it, I just want to briefly mention that the funny stuff going on with the New Knowledge Report, mm-hmm. you know, where they are imitating, you know, they're creating a false flag Russian interference operation in our elections. Mm-hmm. You know, just all this crazy election stuff. Just with that as a background, Jeremy Corbyn, you know, has been smeared mm-hmm. as a Putin puppet. You know, the stuff that's thrown at me is thrown at a lot of people, and it's generally peace advocates and people from the left who are all getting smeared by this McCarthyite campaign. Well, it turns out that people like the New Knowledge folks are kind of working in coalition. There's a thing called the Integrity Initiative, which turns out to be the force behind the smearing of Jeremy Corbyn. Mm. And it is funded by none other than the British military, their intelligence agencies, the U.S. State Department, Facebook, right-wing organizations, and they reach out to media, to big names in media, to academics, and others, you know, and these intelligence professionals to basically orchestrate smear campaigns. So it just, you know, and bear in mind that a couple of years ago, we used to be protected against propaganda here in the U.S. It was against the law to throw propaganda at the American population. That's no longer true. We can be propagandized since like 2013. So with that as a backdrop, we're not protected from the likes of the Integrity Initiative. It's really important to raise the skepticism level and just not take what you hear at face value and to really look at what's behind it. It's a really important lesson for us to learn right now in this age of the new McCarthyism, because it's on us and it's really dangerous. And Rachel Maddow is, you know, she's probably exhibit A for McCarthyism that's just, you know, running mad right now.
Well, I thank you for some common sense and sane talk. I think people should hear more of your message and ranked choice voting, by the way, in corporate channels. But that's why we exist, to kind of try to elevate these topics and discussions. So thanks so much for taking the time.
It's really great talking with you, Jordan, and so glad that you are out there just making the truth be heard. So keep up your good work. Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
You too.